Miss Bachelet, where were you born? Are you local to this area?
No, I was born near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Okay.
It's actually in one of the suburbs. And did you ask me when I was born?
Yeah, what year?
1919.
1919?
Mm-hmm.
So how old would you be at this time?
Right now, I'm almost 92 in March.
Wow, you look great.
Thank you.
How did you get into this area? Like, how did you move from Pennsylvania?
I married a man who had a place near here.
You did? And what was his name?
Bachelet.
Bachelet.
Albert E. Bachelet.
Okay.
I was Janet Bauer.
Mm-hmm. How old were you when you got married?
74.
Oh, really? Wow.
So I only came up here around 1990.
Okay. All right.
So.
So when you were younger in Pennsylvania, did you have aspirations to go to college, or were your plans always for the Air Force?
My dad started savings accounts. There were 4 girls.
Mm-hmm.
And he started savings accounts to send all 4 of us to college, and that was when everybody thought a woman was wasting her time to go there. So anyway, I always thought I was, because of the Depression, I was the only one who got there. One of them had art school training, and the other 2 didn't.
So, how did the Depression affect your family?
Oh, I thought we were doing World War II.
We are. I just, if you don't mind.
I don't mind. It's just that I am going a little bit later to do the Depression, and I thought, oh, I'm not getting it. I didn't make a mistake.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
Okay. And what was the question?
How did the Depression affect your family?
It was terrible because my father was let go in the company that he was in. It was about 1931, I guess. Things had really started getting good for us. And he didn't work again for about 5 years.
Yeah.
And it's money that he had put aside for us. We had some rumors. We had different ways that they kept money. We used to do all of our buying on the south side where the mills had gone quiet. And everything was cheaper, and they used to save things for my mother and dad. That we rent for $5 a week and spend $5 on the south side buying provisions for the next week. It was sort of that way.
Yeah.
He was very... Pittsburgh was terrible. We just made our way through. But somehow or other we didn't feel bad about it. They worried, and we knew they were worried. But we got along.
So you said you did go to college? Which college did you attend?
Again, it was, I had some scholarships and I couldn't afford any of them. But there was one unaccredited school way down in coal mine country, southwestern Pennsylvania. And I got a 4-year scholarship, full tuition. And I was assured by the English teacher that I was going to go to graduate school anyway. And the fact that it wasn't accredited wasn't against it. It was a good school. Well, the president of that school kept it together by having all of the handiwork done by, he'd give tuition for some fellow who could do the plumbing and somebody else to do the electricians and somebody else to do the cooking.
That's a good deal.
And there were nobody there. Everybody worked for some of the money. It was only $100 a semester.
Really?
We didn't have $100,
No.
so that was. I remember once we'd gone to church where it was warm on a cold night and came back and we're sitting in the parlor and a girl came down who did have money and was on her way to buy something. And did we want anything? So one of the fellows looked and each had a dime, and they ordered 2 Cokes, 4 straws, and a bag of popcorn. That was the kind of evening. I mean, it was fun.
Fun, yeah.
We had a lot of fun, but we didn't spend money. So, but at any rate, I finished it. I know, I jumped in on it. But I did finish there, and it was some time later before I went to graduate school. And eventually I went to the University of Chicago and got a PhD.
Wow.
So,
And PhD in what?
human development when that was a new subject.
Wow.
Everybody learns that in their first year of psychology now. But it was the big new subject after the war, just after the war.
So, after grad school, you then entered the Air Force?
No, it was long before I finished. It's when I graduated from college.
College, okay. And then you
Yeah,
went
not way up in Chicago. It was 1941. It was the first class that was entire, the last class that had everybody in it. And one fellow was in uniform because he belonged to the reserves. And from that time on, it just who's where and what's happened to them and things like that.
Well, how was your experience in the, like, as the, you said you were a CAF 5?
Oh, well, just to say a little bit how it affected the college students, they began to teach flight, and there were a fair number of fellows who took flight training on the little Cub airplane. And I remember one did his first solo flight, got lost. They called him Wrong Way Corrigan, which was the current news figure at the time. So anyway, the war started to impinge, and we were talking about Mein Kampf, things like that. But then we all graduated, and the fellows all got drafted. And then I went with my parents for a while. There were some problems, health and things like that. And eventually I went to New York, to Washington, and that was already 53.
Oh, wow.
And that's what I was ready to tell you about, was the Air Transport Command. But I worked in the mill. I didn't want to teach, so I got a job as a stenographer in the mill there on the south side. They started to pick up, go to work again, and so did I. So I thought one of your questions, where was I on December 7th? Because that was while I was still at home, before I went with my parents. And I was just at home. The word came over the radio. We were all struck dumb. And we kept on doing things. I was writing to I think right at the time, I was writing to a fellow who was a Marine pilot in Corpus Christi. So we are all, it was the question, what's going to happen now? But it was huge. It means that anything that's happened since is secondary, no matter how great it is to everybody else. That was terrible.
I imagine.
And we weren't ready. I always do this to you.
No, that's fine.
But we were not ready. I mean, all the equipment, all of the training, everything to wage war was in a shambles, and it was remarkable.
Do you remember the flying of the hump?
Well, that's what I know. Let me tell you this, and then you can decide. I thought that you probably needed to know pretty precisely what the Air Transport Command is. You may have looked it up, but I was
if you'd like to tell me.
Tell you that, and then to tell you what it was like to spend a day there doing the work that we were there to do, and a little bit about what it was like being outside, getting into Washington, the transportation during the war. And then I had to leave briefly and come back, and I worked briefly at the very end of the war. I was at the Junior Red Cross headquarters, and Mrs. Buckman said she thought that was another civilian in the war effort that I should at least. I had a couple of little stories about.
Okay, if you'd like to share them.
Oh, yes, I will. So, do you want to go through with questions, or do you want me to just start to...
If you can just start talking if you like.
Well, did you know what the Air Transport Command, what it is?
Not previous to talking to you.
To finding out. There was the U.S. Army Air Force, and that's the one you think of, where the guys are out there fighting and shooting planes down and everything. But for them to be there, they had to have base camps. And the Air Transport Command was set up to supply everything that they needed to be able to do what they were there to do. So that command had people that would adhere to that. get personnel, they'd get the planes you needed to fly, they'd do all of the things that, there was just so much necessary. And it was divided into, well, we were in the personnel office. That was, so my boss's job was to get the personnel that were needed. And it might be pilots and engineers and navigators, or it might be cooks and bakers, whatever was needed. I know if I start, I go off on all kinds of tangents, so I'll keep going. We were divided into wings, and there was a European wing that went to London, and at that time there was nothing going on in Europe, so it was a pretty stationary wing. All the bases had been set up and were staffed. But then there was the South Atlantic wing that went from South America to Italy or wherever. And there was, well, North Atlantic was called, and the European wing that was just nomenclature at the time. So my boss had the two that were really, really in action. The African Middle East at the time that they were moving eastward across the desert area. And the India-China wing, which at the time was relatively quiet. Just about the time they got everything set in North Africa, the Burma Road fell, and that's when we got into that. I guess that's the best picture you can get, is as the troops moved across Africa, somebody had to set up camp. And I don't think, yeah, that's, and you know about the falling of that. Well, we just kept doing what I'm going to tell you about, our daily routines across Africa, and then the Burma Road fell. And I tell it now or tell it in the daily routine. My boss was a red-faced, wild-haired guy that had made other people cry, and I could understand why, because somebody came by and said, "Larry, aren't you going to that meeting?" And he's in the middle of a teletype at the moment, and he oh yeah, and off he went. And when he came back, he said, "Now where's that telegram?" And I said, "You didn't finish dictating it yet." But that was, and he would come in mad, "Where is it?" But anyway, he was like that, but he was really pretty wonderful. I'll tell you, after the Burma Road fell, he went, and we did the personnel for it, he went over to see how things were doing. And when he came back, I remember two stories. He said there was one man that was carrying so much equipment that every time he moved, he rattled, and every time he rattled, he swore. Then the other one was that he only met one man coming back who didn't want to come back, and he found out he was wanted for some kind of crime, criminal activity in his face. So, at any rate, I think as long as you have that picture, that then I can tell you what it was like. Our job was to get those people. Major Lazar would go to the meetings where something was happening, and they had to get so-and-so from here over there to do whatever had to be done. And the people that had to get all these supports ready, but we were personnel. So he would give me the information, and I typed wires that had to say, be sent to the place where the personnel were, list the personnel, say what their per diem would be, say what kind of equipment they were to have, guns, if they were to have shots of some kind, everything that was necessary for them to be ready to leave. And that had to go in these wires. And I can still remember staying late to type some of them because they went to full page, and then a quarter of the way down another page. They were so long.
Yeah.
So we developed a system where there was an A or something stood for all of the equipment, and a B stood for the per diems, and a C, whatever the variations were, came as numbers underneath. And ended up sending a wire like that, just saying able to and Charlie 3 and what have you. So that was one of the things I remember made a big difference. And then we had to go, before I sent those things, I had to get priority. and there was a priority office. And when I'd walk in, they'd groan. Because ATC had only did the, I mean, most of the time it was something critical. And it might be something like 10 cooks and bakers would go when a general was waiting for a seat. I mean, it was that kind of thing, that if they had, the priority office had to decide who had the priority for whatever seats were available. And I frequently had nothing kinds of people going over, you know, officers, and they all knew it. But that was one of the things that was due there. Let's see. Yeah, I think that's...
Do you remember one of the most intense moments?
Well, I do have a couple of snafus that I was thought would be. One of them was personal. I mean, I knew it, and the other one I heard about, and they both speak of. There was one time that there was they needed somebody somewhere in one of these wings, and the secretaries never knew why, unless they put two and two together, newspapers. But somewhere they had to have somebody ready to leave this country and get there immediately. And they found that there just happened to be some people at Love Field in Dallas that met all of the requirements. They just had to fly over to Florida to meet the, I don't know what, anyway, they were ready to go. And I had typed a wire that ordered them to go. And I could just picture them all at the train station saying goodbye to their wives and everything, when the word came through that there was a group already in Florida ready to go. And they decided, I mean, it was so critical that they let them go first. And then I pictured all these people standing on the platform saying, we're not going after all. So that to me was something that said how some of these things that seemed so awful at headquarters, how could they be so mixed up? That there was behind it some kind of critical need. And the other one that I heard about was that there was a whole shipment of equipment and supplies going to Alaska wing. And while they were in flight, they got word that there was something on that flight was desperately needed in the South Pacific. And they simply sent the crew to the South Pacific. So down in the South Pacific, men got parkas, fur hoods, gloves.
Wow.
How could the country be so mixed up to send that stuff to us? And that's why the stuff was really going somewhere else where it was needed. It was needed more where it went. So I don't know if they fit what you were thinking of, but that was what I thought I would give this kind of personal story.
So you met your husband when you were older in life, right?
Oh yeah, yes, yeah.
Was he in the war effort? Do you recall?
Oh, he certainly. I mean, I know about it because he was at the Bell Labs, and his field was the Bell Laboratories of AT&T.
Okay.
And they were what you could say the foremost research laboratory. They did sound for the sound movies. They did hearing that's now for hearing aids. They just did all kinds of things. But he started out with long distance tracking, calling, when the voice would disappear. And for instance, if you were calling from New York to somewhere up in Maine, by the time it got there, might be 3 times that you couldn't hear it, and the operator would repeat, and they still call them repeater stations. So anyway, from that he went through television, he went through the revolution in computers, and his last job before, he was 20 years older than I, and his last job before he retired was a transmission on Telstar. He was up in Bethel, Maine, when they were doing anything that had to do with transmission equipment was going into Telstar, and that was his field. And during the war, he wanted to see if he could manage to go anyway. He was sure he couldn't, but he went through the whole business, costs, and they were all ready to take him, and he said, I suppose I should show you this. And he showed the letter that said under no circumstances was he to be drafted. He was needed for the war effort at this, in his work there. And I know that I don't know what they are, but I know he had at least 6 patents that were top secret.
Oh, wow.
So he was doing things. One of them, he said that when they were firing at a Japanese plane over a battleship, they'd be following the plane and they'd end up shooting the battleship. And he developed some kind of mechanism that would show how the trajectory of the bill, and when it was time for the officer in charge to say, stop, you're going to hit. So one of the patents was how to get that information.
But he still wanted to be in combat?
Oh, at the time, I think he just wanted to see what he could do and what they would do.
Yeah. Did you find most young men at that time wanted to be drafted?
Everybody that I knew just took it for granted.
They did.
I don't think that I remember anybody, oh boy, I'm going to get a chance,
yeah.
Or, oh, how awful.
Mm-hmm.
They just took it for granted. Everybody that was able had to go. Mm-hmm. And they did.
What was this country like with most of the young men over at war? How was that?
Well, I think that mine was so 6-7 days a week. I was sorry to see this Sunday come because it was so close to Monday. And as a matter of fact, we had Gravelly Point was down by the National Airport, and they had transportation from the old post office down, and you had to get a bus to go down there and to come back. And the last bus left at 6 or 6:30, and if you missed that, you had to go out and wait for a bus coming in from Virginia, and they were always filled to the doors, and they would often just go by and not stop at all. So everybody would take a ride if they could get it. And I might as well tell you this one because it is cooler too. One woman took a ride with a man, and she said he had such interesting eyebrows. She knew she'd seen him somewhere, that she should know who he was. And she said, pardon me, are you Mr. Brown? Are you? Anyway, he said, the name's Brown, ma'am. But when he was letting her out in Washington, he said, the name's Lewis, man. And that was John L., the big labor boss.
Wow.
Who had eyebrows that you could practically shelter under. And that was one of the stories, because she just took whoever came along. And one time I was with one other probably, because we got in the front seat of the little truck. And the fellas, we said, where are you from? Oh, you'll never guess. I said, how about Mauchunk, Pennsylvania? He almost drove off the roadway, as he was. But that was another, just to show that the way we got in town was to take whatever ride offered. It was so crowded. So. And then when you say, what did you do? I know I dated a fellow that I don't remember seeing him a lot. But when we did, he was stationed down in south of the district in Virginia in the Navy. And he would come up, and I think coffee shops, but we'd talk far into the night. And that was, for me, it just was a very stressful time. I really did. I was looking for somebody who was in the South Pacific and hoping that everything was all right, and worried and anxious about this and that, and not having. I went to one enlisted men's affair and didn't like it at all. Anyway, I just didn't do. There wasn't time. I went home and went to get something to eat and went in and did what was necessary and went to sleep and got up and went to work again. And this was very much my wartime experience. But I have letters from one friend who, her future husband went abroad, and her letters are full of the times that she and the other girls went out and danced, and she said how nice it would have been to be dancing with a fella. So there was one group, but she lived in Buffalo, not in Washington, D.C., and she was living at home more or less. She was probably working or something, but not the way we were. Mm-hmm. So my experience was, certainly she shows that mine was not typical.
Yeah. Do you remember when FDR died on April?
I went down to see the funeral parade.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Wow.
No, I'm mixing up that and Eisenhower. Which one?
Franklin Delano Roosevelt, April 1945.
No, I'm talking about with the one where I listened to the whole ceremony on the radio. And I don't know. I know he was in Georgia, and we just heard it by news.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it was his that I saw go by in the catafalque, but I'm not sure.
Not sure.
But we were devastated. That was just a blow.
Mm-hmm.
A real blow. Everybody was hit by that.
Okay.
I remember being on a streetcar, within hours or a couple days of it, and people were just still at a loss.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about Truman's decision to use the atomic bomb against Japan?
I guess I'm in the same place he was, that if I had to put their lives against ours or something, and not knowing as we know what a Pandora's box had opened. Mm-hmm. Pandora's box is beautiful compared to what the atomic bomb opened, but I guess I'd have to be in favor.
Did you feel most people shared your sentiments at that time?
I think so.
Mm-hmm.
That fellow that I had dated in Washington was at Oak Ridge or wherever they were working on it. He said he knew just enough to know that when the atomic bomb was used, that that's what they were working on, but that there were fellows under him who were hammering on pipes and saying, "Boy, I'm glad I had nothing to do with that."
That's funny. So going back to the flying of the hump over the Himalayas, did you know any of the pilots that actually did that?
From stealing from one department to another,
Mm-hmm.
and if you voluntarily left a job, you couldn't rehire in the government for 3 months.
Oh.
And I was ready to go back to work in a couple of months, and I went to work at the Junior Red Cross.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll tell you that just before I say where I went after that.
Okay.
Because the Junior Red Cross, like the Red Cross, had chapters all over the country. And Mrs. Buckman said, be sure to tell you about the Junior Red Cross was sending things to the orphan children
Mm-hmm.
in the war districts. And we got psychiatric advice about whether shoes were better than candy or vice versa. And the answer was both. Send shoes and send candy, because the kids need both. And it seems early, but I'm quite sure it was M&M's, because they were something you could ship, chocolate that you could ship.
Mm-hmm.
So they happened to have a good photographer at a place where these were being given out by, of all things, the Sisters of Charity. And I don't know if you know that anymore, but they wore the great white peaked headdress and white robes.
Mm-hmm.
They were beautiful to look at. And we had photographs of the beautiful Sisters of Charity and a child with shoes like this, and others getting their candy, and the nuns helping them all. So they were a wonderful excuse to go public relations and big papers.
Mm-hmm. And
when it was if it was ordinary stuff, we did it in the Junior Red Cross. If it was really good, it went over to the headquarters across the street. And we had enjoyed these so, and any picture had a standard caption that said what was going on, and one to lead that was specific to the picture.
Mm-hmm.
So these had gone through the whole Red Cross. They'd been typed up and they'd been approved, and they'd come over to us and final approval to the director of the Junior Red Cross. So my boss and I were looking at these and enjoying them tremendously. We read them and looked wonderful, and we gave them over to the boss, and he came storming into the room, waving one of them. Who did this? What? One of the captions with the candy said, "Candy's dandy, but liquor's quicker." Well, that had gone from the typist to the head of her department to the head of publicity to us and to him, and it would have gone out to the newspaper anyway, and he found it. So anyway, that was one thing that the Junior Red Cross did for them. And the other one that I was telling her about is that they discovered, well, K-pop was used for all flotation, and you couldn't get it. It was an Eastern product and no longer available. And they found milkweed was the best substitute. And one thing the chapters did was go out on milkweed searches and send them in to the government. And this news came, and I was a writer for the Junior Red Cross. And I remembered, I don't know if you know the house that Jack built. This is the house that Jack built. This is the malt that lay in the house. This is the rat that ate the malt. Well, I made a thing like that where I used milkweed instead of K-pop, and I looked and looked to find that because I have it somewhere. I just moved here and I don't know where anything is. So I don't know. But that was another kind of thing that the chapters did, was anything that they could to help the war effort. And I was working at the headquarters that tried to publicize the best things they did. So after the war, what's your question?
Well, you met and married your husband, of course.
Not for many years.
Not for many. Why, if you mind, why is that? Were you just busy with work, or?
Oh, everybody would ask all the time, why aren't you married? So if you can ever figure that out, you tell me. No, I don't have any, I had no principle. It was not for this or against that. It was just the way things turned out. And it turned out that I didn't meet the person I was hoping to meet.
So looking back on the war, would you say it had a positive effect on your life? Or do you harbor ill will?
Well, I guess I just have a general feeling that everything is a positive effect if you use it that way in the long run. And I can't say that anything happened that was, I learned some negative things about some of the people. I learned not to say certain things to one woman who turned out, reported everything that was useful to the commander.
Boy.
And she was very sweet and people liked her very much, and they didn't know that if they confided in her that it was dangerous.
Snitch.
So I learned a few things.
Yeah.
But mostly, all my life, better people around. Better all the time.
Well,
So I don't think it was negative, and I don't think it was truly positive. It was just what happened.
Yep. Well, that's all I have today. So
I'm still in touch with my wartime boss's daughter.
Oh, you are?
Daughter.
Oh, wow.
He died at 101.
Oh my gosh, wow.
And she's out in New Zealand, and I still hear from her.
Oh, well, that's really great. Do you keep in touch with anyone else from that time, or just her?
Oh, I have, yeah, I have college friends. We had our 70th anniversary about 4 years ago.
Wow.
The anniversary
That's
of
great.
meeting. No, I've kept in touch until, by this time, they're dying. But I've been in touch until they died with an awful lot of people from college and work.
Yeah. Well, I think that about sums it up. Thank you very much.